There's a Wesleyan quadrilateral
Oh,
too.
never mind. Okay.
No,
I only know
you don't wanna
Bevingtons.
know.
Okay.
You don't want to know. Just
Okay,
No.
never mind. Never mind.
No, there's no spiritual edification there. Oh, and welcome to another episode of Plain Truth, a Holy Spirited podcast. I am Maggie Elmer, and I am on Zoom today with
Scott Kisker.
David Watson.
Karen
And
Swallow Pryor.
yes, our special guest, Dr. Karen Swallow Pryor. I'm very excited. Because
me too. Yeah.
my inner lit nerd has been very excited about this for a while, and I wish today that our podcast was really just all about books, but that's okay. We can talk about church.
We could talk about books.
We can
and
talk
church.
about books too if you want, Maggie. Like, you're leading this train. Just take us
You're the
down
trail
whatever
boss,
track you want
Maggie.
to take us down. I mean,
But
no.
Dr.
David and I are
Pryor,
academics. Even if we haven't read the books, we can talk about them.
I know you have opinions about everything. Dr. Pryor, could you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am a research professor of English and Christianity and Culture at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, which is in Wake Forest, North Carolina. And I live in Central Virginia. I have been teaching for 3 decades now at the college level in various places. And I am a reader and a writer. I write a column for Religion News Service monthly that you can check out, and write books now and then. So
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And I know that one of the ways I'm familiar with you is initially, well, from reading. My husband bought your book for me a few years back called On Reading Well, because that's a passion of mine, just reading, but also the manner in which we read. But also, as your Twitter handle implies, you have a very sort of a large presence on Twitter, on social media. And so many of our listeners may be familiar with you from there. So how does that happen? How do you go from PhD research professor to the notorious KSP?
I wish I had an answer to that question. It's really kind of embarrassing to think like, I'm big on Twitter. Wow. Not exactly what you dream of when you're a kid, I guess.
You and the Donald.
Yeah,
Oh no.
my. I really don't know. I mean, I guess that I have carved out a niche, being an academic, but also a lot of my work is sort of like translating my discipline, which is literature, for a general audience. And so I'm kind of in that space, a bridge between the academic world and the real world. And so Twitter is a great place to do that. And maybe a more a more satisfying answer to why I'm on Twitter and do well on Twitter is my academic field is 18th century British literature, which is really known for, among other things, for its wit and its aphoristic style, just kind of saying punchy things quickly. Alexander Pope is known for his heroic couplets, which are, 2 lines of poetry written in iambic pentameter. Now, I don't write in iambic pentameter, but Twitter is a place that invites, short, quick, witty responses, and so I kind of love it. So can I kind of say it's because of my academic specialty? I mean, I guess I can say it whether it's true or not, but there is a connection there that I see. So maybe
Seems
that's
to me Twitter would definitely be improved by some iambic pentameter.
it definitely would.
I'm just trying
Maybe you
to
should start
imagine.
that, Scott.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know me.
I'm trying to imagine.
My wife was a Shakespeare person, so at least I've got that going for me.
Yeah, Roberta could speak well. I bet she could roll that off pretty easily, actually. She's very studied in that.
Though she's not on the Twitters though.
This is true.
That I know of.
Well, we it's fascinating. I have to say I have a bit of a fraught relationship with social media, and I'm sort of simultaneously drawn to it and then constantly pushing back against my own worst impulses to fire off something not necessarily witty and punchy, but sanctified and productive than that. But hopefully most of the time I'm able to resist that impulse. But one of the ways that you seem to really, in a sense, to make waves, and I hate to sort of emphasize that, but is your take on various things happening in the evangelical landscape. And I mean, I'm actually very quite grateful for your voice. I'm just as another woman and as another woman with who holds sort of to the historic doctrines of the church. I don't feel like I'm always, whenever I see those voices, I'm always like, hi, over here. Nice to see you over there. But I'm just wondering, like, what has that been like for you, in your particular traditional context?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it's been challenging and hard, but in other ways it just feels very natural. I mean, I kind of got my I mean, I guess I mean, my strongest spiritual gift is prophecy. So speaking out about the truth is not really a choice for me. It's just something that I'm compelled to do. And so I've just had to learn, that part isn't hard. It's the harder part is just learning, how and when and how to just be more tactful and restrained. And I mean, when I was in my 20s in a PhD program, I was protesting abortion, outside my university and in my university neighborhood. So I guess I am just used to saying things and being criticized and taking a lot of hits in one way or another. So in some ways, that was practice for Twitter. I guess that was just practice for the real fire.
Yeah, David knows about that.
I've taken a lot of flack in my own denomination, but which is the United Methodist Church. But it is hard. I mean, it does wear. At least for me, it wears on me after a while. And you've taken a lot more. Just your social media presence is so large.
Yeah.
You've gotten a lot of criticism, and one of the things that I wanted to ask you is just how do you handle that with such grace? Is it you seem very composed in this, but I know that sometimes these things have to sting a little bit.
I mean, I think that I went through a very hard trial in 2015 when I was suddenly viciously attacked and slandered and misrepresented by some people in my denomination, and I did not even know. I was new to SBC. My denomination is Southern Baptist, and even though I've been Southern Baptist for over 20 years, I was new to sort of being in the denomination and in the spotlight. And I didn't know, I literally did not know that people existed who called themselves Christians, who wrote blogs slandering and misrepresenting and attacking other people. Like, I did not know until I woke up one day in 2015 and it had happened to me. And so that was really disorienting and hard. And I mean, I literally got sick and had nightmares and developed TMJ, which crops up now and then. So that was hard. But a friend of mine, one of my close, in real life real life friends said to me recently how she, because she walked through that with me and saw me, and she just sees how I now just brush it all off. That's what she sees, is me just like, it doesn't bother me at all compared to like that time a few years ago. And so her just sort of seeing the difference between then and now shows, I guess, that I've gotten used to it. I've grown, I've gotten a thicker skin, and so that's probably true. But part of what also, so that was very disorienting and hard, mainly not because, as I said before, when I was protesting abortion and being attacked by people who were against, hostile to Christianity, that was one thing. But having this be done by people who say they're Christians was just, it was just very disorienting. So that was hard, but the rest of it is, I think what helps me through the sort of day-to-day trolling and criticism and questions is that I'm a teacher. And so I'm used to being around people all day long who are wrong and who need to learn things. So that's just my posture. Like, I'm just used to, like, I'm here to teach the world to sing or whatever. And I mean, I say that, I don't mean that I'm always right. I just mean that my job is to teach people, and to learn myself as I'm doing that. And so to me, I just see the world, unless they're like slandering me and attacking me. Everyone else, I'm just like, okay, hey, you want to know what I think? Here's what I think. And you want to know how you're wrong? Here's how I think you're wrong. And I don't take it personally.
It's an excellent quality.
Yes, it is.
There's
It
this-
occurs to me, one of the ways that Christians can teach people is by our public conduct. And, there are ways in which, I mean, it's so easy to just get zingers off on Twitter or Facebook or something like that. And I'm tempted to so often also. But I guess, one of the things that I admire about you, Dr. Pryor, is the way that you model the fruit of the Spirit in your engagement.
Mhm.
And that's a great witness for people who are looking at Christians who may not be Christians and say, what are these people about? Because, as you know, we've got a lot of bad examples of that. Scott, I'm sorry I cut you off.
Well, I was just, one of the things that made me think of, being a church historian and all this, there's a famous Methodist 18th century woman preacher and theologian, Mary Bosanquet Fletcher. And I just pulled up a quote from her. She traveled and in 18th century England. And she said, all that I have suffered from the world in the way of reproach and slander is little in comparison with what I have suffered from some professors of religion, as well as even ministers of the gospel. So it just reminded me, that in 2015, I mean, you were somehow shocked that, wow, these people are in the church and theoretically they've, heard of Jesus, and yet here we are, right?
Here we are. Yes.
Yeah.
Mm.
This makes me think actually of something that I was listening to earlier today. So I was doing a little bit of prep before this interview, and I was listening to a podcast that you were on, and you were discussing the cultivation of platform. And you said this really, of course, I can't remember now that I can't remember the name of the podcast that you were just on.
Probably Viral Jesus is where I talked about that recently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. I think that, and you said this thing, you said that the work is the platform. And I really loved that. One, I love that because I work in a ministry and I have to balance, writing, creating content with also just administrative things. And there's always 1,000 reasons to not actually sit down and write, and to actually just do the work that is the reason the ministry exists. Also, I was thinking about how part of the work is protecting it, is just putting those boundaries around it. And I was struck by, I know this is happening in our denomination, and I was just wondering your thoughts on this, is that sometimes I feel like in any institution, but I know it's happening in ours, that the work has become protecting the platform as opposed to saying what it is, like just doing the thing. And I feel like when churches, whether I'm talking institutionally, denominationally, or individual churches, when it becomes about protecting the platform as opposed to doing the actual work of ministry, automatically we've switched to a paradigm of power, of protecting power. And I was just wondering what you thought about that, whether or not that was something you could relate to, or
you just put it so well, and I have never really thought about it that way. I mean, obviously I've thought about the way that the institutions are protecting themselves and their power and all that, but when you said that the work becomes protecting the platform, that's exactly what we're talking about, and that is exactly getting everything upside down, isn't it? And that's what we're fighting against. And I mean, I believe in institutions.
Yeah.
And so, and I'm sympathetic to protecting them because, we can do so much more together than apart, right? I mean, it's just sort of a basic. And so I understand that fine line, but some of these lines are not that fine, and so many of them are being crossed when we are sacrificing, vulnerable souls to the institutions and forgetting the mission and replacing the mission with the platform. So I think you put that so well, and I'll probably be borrowing and stealing it. But you'll get credit. No, that's exactly what's going on. That's exactly what's going on.
Yeah. What were you going to say, David?
Well, I was going to say, so you're a Southern Baptist, and in some ways have been an outspoken voice for reform in your tradition. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yes.
Especially because in the Southern Baptist Convention, there have been scandals lately, and I'm not here to, take shots at Southern Baptists. I'm not. There are no problem-free.
We don't have any ground to stand on.
Yeah, right. But these discussions about the Southern Baptist Convention have been very public, and a lot of people calling for more transparency, more integrity in governance. And you've been one of those voices. So, what are your concerns and what are your hopes for your own tradition?
That also has been a little disorienting because I grew up in the church, started out Methodist. That's another story, but just, I come from New England.
We always lose them.
Well,
we'll take you back. We'll take you back.
I come from Maine, and Methodist, there were not a lot of Southern Baptists or any kind of Baptists in New England. So it's like everyone was Methodist. But from a young age, my parents ended up, kind of really getting saved and baptized in a Baptist church after being nominal Christians. And so I pretty much grew up in the Baptist church, whether it was independent Baptist or, Baptistic, and came to a Southern Baptist church upon moving to the South, all of that. And so I was in Baptist churches for decades, and I don't know if I was blind or lucky, but I just didn't see, I didn't know that there were these kinds of problems. And so the first time that I was made aware that there was a problem in our leadership, with, a former denominational leader, being very lascivious and rude about women and girls and so forth. I was just dumb and just thought, oh, this is bad. Let's talk. We don't accept this, do we? And then, after basically coming public with that kind of statement and a petition or whatever, realize, oh no, we do allow this. And so I'm, just in the past few years, really getting a better understanding of these institutional kinds of powers and structures that have been in place for a long time and have been used by some to cover up and protect abuses and greed and corruption. And so I feel very new to this in many respects, but also just felt initially sort of like, the emperor has no clothes, like, oh, this is wrong. We would not accept this, would we? And wasn't really prepared for the answer that I got to that. So but I, as you said before, like, these no denomination is safe from these things. And so I don't see it as necessarily a mark on my denomination. It's just it's part of the it's the flip side of the good that institutions can do, is that they also can be used to protect the wrong people and the wrong acts. And so I do accept that and just feel called, like, wherever I am, I mean, God has put me here. And so it's, I just feel convicted to speak up where I am, as I think, more of us should where we are.
So earlier interview, you were talking about your discipline and sort of describing yourself as a translator, a bridge. Is there a connection between that work and what you sort of do in the realm of speaking out against these things? Do you think there's a connection?
That's a good question. I never really thought about that. But since you're saying it, I guess I'm just a person for a variety of reasons who's often felt like it kind of inside and outside and an outsider. And I don't mean that in like a romantic way, maybe a Jane Eyre way or something, but just kind of like not quite fitting in wherever I am. And so there's a part, because I do feel like as I'm getting more aware of of institutional powers and traditions and cultures, I realize that there are people who've grown up so inside these that it's hard to see things, and then when you do see them, there's a sense of betrayal, and people leave, and they often leave loud and leave and leave dramatically, and I understand that. But I think because I've just always grown up with my whole life just kind of in, but not entirely in, and not being just feeling a little disconnected, there's a freedom that comes with that to just to call it out, to say it as it is, whether it's the denominational abuses we're talking about, or just literature. Like, literature actually and literary interpretation understanding is not something that comes that easily to me. I love it, but because I have to work at it, I feel like I'm translating it for myself as I'm translating it for other people. And so maybe that there's a little bit of that outsider sense of being an outsider. I don't come from an academic family. I never even knew about academic life. And so coming to something a little from the outside, I guess, makes me able to see things a little bit differently, and also to feel like I have less to lose by just saying it how it is.
Yeah. And it's also a very prophetic thing. I mean, if you think about just the prophets, they were hardly what we would call, like, I often think that people who carry the spiritual gifts, and particularly prophetic spiritual gifts, they're often like a little on the inside, a little on the outside.
I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, it's true.
Oh.
It's true. I mean, you think about Jeremiah or Ezekiel or Moses, they weren't like normal. Go ahead, David, Scott. I see your mic's unmiked.
I mean, I'd actually love to hear you talk a little bit about 19th century literature. I don't know if that's a thing. I mean, are you like a romantic person? Are you more like Sense and Sensibility, or Frankenstein? What's
Well, all of the above. So no, that's a good question. I love that you asked if I'm a romantic person, because I'm so not. Like, actually, my whole identity and my impulse and motivation is toward anti-romanticism. And I'm trying to understand and embrace romanticism a little bit more later in life. So my area of specialty is 18th century British literature, which is neoclassical and and satirical and very it's what the Romantics reacted against.
Right.
However, I also, within the 18th century and then later 19th century, my other area, my specific area of specialty is the English novel, which began in the 18th century, but also developed in the 19th century. So I love the novels. I just edited this year a new edition of Frankenstein in a series of 6 novels that I've edited. And Frankenstein was always it's the romantic novel, and it's the one that I taught because I felt obligated to teach the Romantics. Like I had to do that to serve my students well. But I am slowly over time part of, I think, the reason why I was so anti-romantic for so long was, yes, I loved 18th century neoclassicism, but also I saw more romantic elements in our culture. Like we're overly romantic. And so part of me would just wanted to push against that and be like, no, we need a little neoclassical aesthetics and satire and so forth here. But as we go further and further into late modernity, and I'm seeing sort of the outgrowth of this separation, this dualistic approach that we have to mind and body, and to soul and spirit, soul and mind. I think therefore I am. There's so much that's gone wrong with that kind of thinking that I'm starting to appreciate the way the Romantics fuse those 2 aspects of ourselves together, like through the imagination, like understanding how the imagination is what connects our bodies and our minds, and really does form us in ways that that we're just really beginning to realize. There's so much good work being done by literary critics and philosophers that kind of pick up where the Romantics left off in a way that I think is more compatible with some of the things I love about the neoclassical age. So yeah, that's my first answer to your question.
Well, I liked
That's
it.
awesome. I, before the podcast, for the sake of the listeners, I had a slight like fangirl moment about the book Jane Eyre. It was telling Dr. Pryor is one of my all-time favorite books, and that it has traveled with me through my life like a friend. I have a couple of books like that, but I am a very relational reader, which is sort of like, as a reader, is a great, like, I think it's a good thing, but also it presents some problems when you have to read something for instance what it's saying, and not necessarily for how you want to feel about it, and or those 2 things can get mixed up. Anyway, all that to say, I tend to go through these like deep connections to a genre of literature, and I will like read it and then be like, okay, I did that, and move on to the next thing. One genre of literature, and it's not fictional literature in a sense, but I went through a long period of time where I just read medieval mystics, just one after the other. And you want to talk about like having strange thoughts after reading book after book after book like that. Do that. It's weird. But I feel like I noticed like there were parallels between some of the intense, like the intense leaning into deep piety in those writings. And I have read, like I read a lot of Bronte sisters growing up, and Mary Shelley and all of those. And I feel like there's a similar feeling there between, say, for instance, Catherine of Siena, who wants to like just give herself completely and utterly over to, the spirit of Jesus Christ. And then the same sort of deep longing for a larger life of internal life of the mind that maybe Jane Eyre has, or the longing for that Heathcliff, and of course I can't remember her name right now. Anyway,
Catherine. Is it Catherine?
Catherine,
Yeah,
thank
yeah.
you. Yeah, it's Catherine. That was less a favorite. I wasn't as in love
Yeah,
with that
same
one,
here.
but
Same here. I'm Team
yeah,
Jane Eyre.
yeah, all the way. It took me forever to get through that book, honestly. Not Jane Eyre, but through you know,
Wuthering
Heathcliff and
Heights.
Cat. Yes, took me forever. Anyway, it's fascinating. I don't know why I probably making this connection because I've read these two things, these two families of books, but I I just think it speaks to, God has planted within us this just deep desire for eternity, for more than just whatever our social constructs are. Like, we're given calling, we're given purpose, and we have the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit speaks to us, and these things are so big. And then life can be very mundane and feels so incongruent sometimes. Anyway, I don't have a question. I'm just rambling.
Well, no, I will say that incongruency that you talked about is actually why the most formative book that I ever read in my life was Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, because he, takes this woman has Emma Bovary, who's been reading too many novels and has this view of life that is romantic and over the top and unrealistic, and it robs her of her ability to reconcile those visions with the sort of ordinary everyday life around her, with a sort of bumbling but kind doctor husband that she has. And so she ends up, without spoiler alerts, just like having affairs that lead her into a, ever increasing spiral of destruction, because she can't reconcile the real ordinary mundane world with these books that she's been reading, but also that those books do tap into this desire that you talked about that we all have. And so the real trick is, it's so easy to either just get caught up in the ordinary and ignore the transcendent, and it's also easy to get lost in the transcendent. But the real trick is to connect both of those things, to live in, to see the transcendent in the ordinary, and to see, God in in eternity and everyday life. That's hard. And Emma Bovary was the book that made me understand that more than any other.
That's awesome. I homeschool our kids, and my husband and I, our children. And one of the things that happens a lot in homeschooling circles is just discussions of books to read, books not to read, especially through the lens of, the Christian worldview. And I tend to be of the camp of like, read everything, have Christian worldview, and just read and understand what you're reading.
That's what Christian worldview is, I thought.
Yeah. So in particular, I've gotten flack before for allowing my kids to, say, for instance, read Harry Potter or whatever. And and I'm often like, well, fairy tales, I mean, these things are, anyway, all that is, don't need to go off into that tangent, but I'm just wondering, like, do you ever feel like if Christians could read anything to sort of help them, like read novels, what would you say? Hey, read this novel. This is great, because there's real Christian virtue to be sort of gained here, or wisdom about the world, and it doesn't all have to be explicitly Jesus, although everybody should read their Bibles.
I think a great book that does that is John Steinbeck's East of Eden.
Oh, I love that book.
It's a great story. There's like, excuse me, nothing explicitly biblical about it, except for the fact it's very biblical. It's repeating sort of some of the major stories of the Old Testament in sort of this other story. So I think that's a great book that shows what all literature can do a little bit more literally, maybe, than other work. So
that's my eldest daughter Maria's favorite book. She's read it like,
oh wow,
like that. Yeah,
great choice.
I mean, I know maybe we're in areas that our listeners are not that familiar with too much, but I'm curious about like 18th century classicism. I think of that, and this is partly probably ignorance, which I'm well aware of, but I think of it as like bawdy kinds of literature often. Like
It's very body.
Tom
Yes.
Jones and
Yes.
stuff like that, and
Yes.
not a super Christian worldview. Not that of course Christians can't be a little bawdy, but I don't think of the 18th century as anyway. I don't know. I'm not sure.
No, that's one of the reasons.
But
One of the reasons I love teaching that literature is because it's so shocking to my evangelical students. But but it's also, I mean, most of these novels were written by Anglican clergymen.
Yeah. Well, what does that tell you?
I know, but it's so interesting because their understanding of Christianity was so different and what it means to be a Christian. Now some of them would have been like what we would call today more liberal. I get that, but still they were. It's important to understand that what we actually, this is the subject of my next book, but not to give too much away, but what we take to be biblical Christianity in 21st century evangelicalism today is often, it's really more Victorian than it is biblical. And so the Victorian age came after, just for those who don't know the math, came after the neoclassical age. And so it's very shocking for students sometimes to see these ministers, these clergymen writing these bawdy novels that do have a moral lesson. Actually they're very moralistic, yet they just don't have that Victorian prudishness that we have inherited. I mean, Shakespeare's the same. Like people,
right.
I mean, Shakespeare's pretty bawdy, but his works exhibit a highly integrated Christian worldview. I mean, you can't separate Shakespeare from Christian worldview.
And Chaucer too. I
mean, Chaucer. Chaucer. I'm more Chaucer than Shakespeare myself. But I did, I mean, like the first year I was teaching after getting my PhD and going to an evangelical university, making my syllabus. And I was just so excited about all the works, and I didn't understand the context. And I had put the Miller's Tale on the syllabus, and then I was preparing. I was preparing for class, and I realized, oh, here's a story about adultery and flatulence. It ends with a joke about a fart. And by that time I had been, there for a few weeks in my first semester. And I just the day before we were supposed to discuss, I said, we're going to just discuss whatever. I took it off the syllabus because I was afraid to talk. I was like, oh, these kids can't handle that. They're evangelicals. So that's what I did. I was afraid to teach it. But why should we be afraid to teach bawdy Chaucer? because we're more Victorian than we are Christian. Go ahead. No.
Well, I mean, we're a products of a revival that went through the 18th century, but evangelicalism doesn't emerge, as a culture really, right. As anything but a counterculture until the 19th century. Right. So when we think of evangelicalism as a sort of coherent culture in and of itself, that is Victorian, right?
Right. Exactly.
Well, it also seems to me that in the cultural moment that we're in is one in which various groups of people, from conservative evangelicals to the most progressive, feel like we have to be protected from ideas. We can't engage ideas that we don't like or agree with or that are somehow threatening. I mean, that in the book The Coddling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt, that's what the whole book is about, is that we've entered this cultural moment where where we think that we have to be protected from certain or even deserve to be protected from certain ideas, and that's just a very illiberal way of doing business. And I don't mean liberal like in the political way. I mean liberal in the classical sense of
Books.
in books, learning, the willingness to engage ideas, get all the ideas out on the table and hash it out. And that is just a hard sell these days. I think maybe it's coming back a little bit, but I see it in the evangelical world. I see it in progressive social media and news media and academia. Large segments of academia have really bought into this as well.
No, I agree. And I think there's a Victorian impulse behind that too, a sort of protectiveness and insularity and even a kind of imperialism, right? Because imperialism sort of inherently um, assumes that some ideas are better than others, and it assumes that to bring, to that the way to spread what we believe is to be the truth is not through engagement, but through colonization. So that comes, I think, from this Victorianism that we call evangelicalism today.
It's really strange because I often think about the ministry that I work for, we do a lot of equipping and we do a lot of evangelism and discipleship. And when you talk about discipleship, you often talk about the apostolic calling, to go out and spread the gospel. And, often there's a moment where we discuss what that word means, apostle. And, historically it was, people coming and implementing their culture on top of another culture. And I'm sure David can correct me as a Greek professor, but it's fascinating because I feel like a lot of times when I'm having conversations with other Christian leadership or other Christian parents in homeschooling environments, the protectiveness is seen as a way of preserving culture, and as if, and I sometimes I struggle with how to articulate how to get behind that idea, say, no, this is wrong. First of all, theologically, this is not accurate. This is not an accurate representation of the victory that Christ has over sin. That's just, we don't need to, this is not a big worry. Ideas can't get you. But the other thing is, it seems counter to just the call evangelize world, this kind of insular perspective, that we have to keep people out rather than invite them in and let love be the transformative thing. And we just are so hell-bent on not being uncomfortable, it's just so strange to me. It is anti Great Commission. It's weird. I don't know. Anyway.
I mean, it goes back to that idea of coddling, right? I mean, it's a faith that's built on coddling, which is going to ultimately be weak, because it takes exercise and energy and exposure to make one strong. So,
where do you think this comes from? I mean, just besides the sort of anemic, sort of inner life of mainly Protestantism, which we talk a lot about on this podcast. But I mean, I'm just wondering, what are your perspectives on just education generally? I mean, do you think that this is a factor? I read a lot about it out there, and I'm always kind of I'm suspicious of one thing being the reason why everything is not working.
I do think a lot of it comes from that Victorian mindset, not to keep, I mean, that is when widespread education was implemented.
I really don't like the Victorians, do you?
I love the Victorians. That's what I mean, because there's so much good there, but then the flip side is bad. They're so paradoxical. And so I love the period, and I love, they were so they so focused on family values and on the home and the nuclear family, and yet they had like this super high rate of prostitution. It's just fascinating because they embody kind of the way that if we go too far in one extreme, we just we turn to the other extreme. So
did you say a super high rate of prostitution?
Oh yeah. Oh, prostitution
Oh, okay.
was a huge problem in the Victorian age, which is so interesting because they were so prudish and modest and and striving. They weren't baughty like in the 18th century, right? And so it's just
Or
it
the
makes
17th. I mean, was it a problem? Right? Was it a problem because it was a problem, whereas in the 18th and the 17th century it wasn't a problem? It just was, right?
Possibly, but I understand that the rate was very, very high. Not just that it was a moral problem, but it increased rapidly because maybe there was just so much repression.
Well, there's urbanization and there's everybody moving off the land to centers, and I mean the collapse of the rural safety network and all of that stuff. Played a big young women moving to cities with no guardianship probably that had then too, but
it seems to me like we've talked a lot about evangelicalism, or at least touched on it several times in the podcast so far. It seems to me like in North America, the evangelical movement is in a big fat mess right now. And for a long time, whereas the main line was declining quite rapidly, and now that has accelerated, the evangelical churches are declining as well, and that hasn't always been the case. And on the one hand, you have kind of the mainlineification of evangelicalism, where evangelicals are becoming more. Some evangelicals, not all, but some evangelicals are adopting ideas that have been around in mainline Protestantism, liberal Protestantism for a while, and going in that direction. And on the other hand, you have a lot of the evangelical movement that seems to be seeking after power and trying to do that through various political alliances. And neither of these, in my opinion, are positive developments, but I don't quite know how we right the ship. And I was wondering, what do you think has to happen in the evangelical movement for us to rediscover what it means to be evangelical Christians in a historic and faithful sense?
Well, I think that is what's happening right now, and I think I think it's happening as a result of sort of natural consequences, but also God's mercy. I mean, what's happening right now is that things are being revealed, things that have been underneath the surface all along that are very hard to see and know are being shown for what they are, and it's disorienting and it's unsettling and it's sad and it's there's a great loss that comes along with it, but I really believe, again, to go back to Chaucer, it's so different to teach the Canterbury Tales now than it was 10 or 20 years ago, because 10 or 20 years ago, for me, I even had a hard time wrapping my mind around how the medieval church could be so corrupt and people not see it. And now here we are, and I'm like, oh, this is how it happens. We're not that different. And so I think we're in, a 300 or possibly even 500-year moment where we are seeing corruption that has been there all along, festering and growing, in the same way that it's happened before in the church. And I think we have to be faithful through it. And the thing that just helps me, because it is very hard, but the thing that helps me is to just remind this is just the way I think. It may not help other people, but I think, okay, so 100 or 200 years from now, church historians like Scott are going to write about this. And what are they going to say about what are they going to say about who and what party? And I want to be, I'm going to be faithful. I may not live to see the end of this moment of revelation, but I know it's going to be written about, and I know something is going to be said about how the true church shone through, and there were faithful people who advanced the gospel and protected the true church. And I just want to be part of that story that's told, because that story has been told before. I mean, we're not unique. And so the church is constantly, going to be refined and chastened. And we're just living through one of those moments, which I just never saw it coming, but here it is. And I'm here. Yeah, I'm here for the future.
One of the things that's been fascinating to watch is the sort of strange alliances on both sides, in both sort of camps that have come out of this bizarre season, like spiritual leaders who are standing on platforms together, and I just think, okay, sure, that's really strange. And then I know,
like, who are you talking about?
I'm talking about like strange, like for instance, in this past election, I thought this was strange. This sort of the coming together of like hyper charismatic factions of the church, and then very sort of evangelical factions of the church. And it's not that I just never saw those two groups coming together, but they were aligned across under the purpose of political advancement. And
they align across the values that are most important to them.
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, that was terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, it was really terrifying to watch it, in my opinion, because I have friends who are Southern Baptist and who hold somewhat of a slightly cessationist view of the gifts. And then I have friends who are just sort of non-denominational evangelical who don't hold a cessationist view of the gifts, but it's just not a context that they've grown up in. And then I have charismatic friends who are, who also hold their own sort of special sort of self-righteousness about the idea that everything they do is beyond reproach and it's the most perfect thing that they could do. And then to see all of that sort of come together under the scrum of Donald Trump was bizarre. And also, I think what was disturbing about it was because the lines of division that they held so strongly before, they held in the name of spiritual conviction. And even if I didn't agree with those convictions, I could at least say, but we agree about these other convictions, unity in Christ. But actually, those weren't their convictions at all. Their convictions were this social ideology. And to have that revealed so publicly was, just for me, that was strange and really disheartening. But the flip side has also been equally just amazing to see people come across denominational lines, Protestants and Catholics, cats and dogs, it's just really neat. And, Scott often, as a church historian, he has this diagram. I call it but he has this diagram that describes the church and all these denominations. And just as you articulated earlier, Dr. Pryor talks about how there are the true church is within all of these expressions. And then there's, adulterations within all of those expressions also. But yeah, that's been our podcast today, you guys. Thank you so much for listening. Of course, we're always grateful to our guests for coming on, and we're super grateful to Dr. Pryor today. And Dr. Pryor, is there, obviously, if you want to follow her on Twitter, it's at Notorious KSP, but also
it's at KS Pryor. And then KS my
Pryor.
handle is it's confusing, but yeah.
what's your latest project that you're just like, hey, everybody go out and get this? Because I feel like you have things coming out all the time.
Well, what's out there now is the first 4 books in my series of edited classics from B&H Publishing. So my own edition with notes and commentary on Jane Eyre, Austen's Sense and Sensibility, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And then next year, the last 2 will be coming out. The Scarlet Letter and Tess of the D'Urbervilles. So these are volumes that are to serve as like introductions to anyone who's not read them, but also people who love them, I think are getting something out of it too. It's like taking a college class with me is what people say. So
nice.
There you go.
So you guys go check out those books and go follow Dr. Pryor on Twitter because she's a great follow, and it's also just kind of super entertaining to watch people's heads explode when she says things. And that's been our podcast today. Give us a follow on Twitter at Holy Spirit Pod, and we want to just give a shout out to Spirit and Truth, of whom this podcast is a ministry. Go follow us there at Spirit Truth Life. Thanks so much. We'll come back to you next time. Bye.
Bye.